Yesterday we discussed the name of Rav Chaim Volozhiner. What exactly is the world to come? What exactly is what we call Gehenna, spiritual hell? There's no location which is designated for punishment. And if you are liable at certain levels, it's this punishment or that punishment. But rather, well, what one creates in his own lifetime, that is what one reaps after he passes away. Positive and negative. As they say, as you sow, that's how you reap. And that's exactly what it is. You sow responsibly, you reap well. You sow irresponsibly, what do you have? You have thorns and weeds. We've mentioned many times the name of Rav Chaim Vital, who was the student of the Arizal, who recorded all his Kabbalistic writings, teachings, that just as the body has 248 parts to it, the 248 components to the soul. And we have 248 positive commandments, and every commandment corresponds to one part of the soul. So when we do, God gave us mitzvos, the positive commandments, that commandment, when you do it at various levels, it generates an energy, and that energy sustains that component of the soul. And every time you fulfill that commandment, which sometimes is continuous, like the study of Torah, or you eat tefillin, or eat tzitzis, or eat matzah at the Seder, that corresponds to one aspect of your soul, that component, and it brings about an enrichment of that, and it gives that soul relevance to eternity at various levels. That's what it is. But why that particular mitzvah? Because God chose, God understanding the makeup of our soul and what is needed to give it relevance to eternity and give it a commonality with him. So those mitzvos, they're only purely symbolisms. Every mitzvah is only a representation of something in the spiritual realm. When you do this, it brings certain energies into being. It's very interesting. We talk about ex nihilo. You take a match and you strike it. Before you strike the match against that rough surface, there's no fire. But when you strike it, the fire's created. Where did the fire come from? The answer is because if you understand the makeup of what that tip of the match is, the chemical makeup, if you create some level of friction, that creates fire. But the fire is like coming out of nowhere, relatively speaking. Didn't exist, now fire exists. We do an action. You put on tefillin. The tefillin itself is a leather box with parchments with writings in it, sewn together with straps. If you put that on your arm, on your head, and you have a mind that has a certain degree of representation, it activates unlimited forces which have no relevance to this existence, which only have relevance to eternity. How does it work? It's only because God, only he understands that the tefillin only a representation of something in the spiritual realm, and this is the activator, and that actually ignites those forces and releases those forces. As a result of that, it brings about an enrichment to every component of our neshama, because only God knows, because God knows the makeup of our soul. He created our soul, and he created the system which provides the enrichment for every component of the soul. That's the understanding. The only one who's qualified to write a Sefer Torah is only a Jew. A non-Jew could have the most beautiful handwriting, calligraphy, and he could write a Sefer Torah like no one could write in the physical form. But in terms of its innate holiness, it doesn't have holiness. It only takes on that new dimension of holiness if it's written by a person who's qualified to write it. But if the Sefer Torah is only the words and the parchment and the way it's sewn together, and even if the non-Jew has the proper thought, it doesn't make the grade. Why? Because again, The Jew has a certain level of representation because of his core, which is his soul. That soul allows him to infuse that parchment with the writing with a degree of value which represents holiness. And there's nothing holier than the Sefer Torah itself. That's what it is. So what is the Sefer Torah? It's not the physical parchment. It's not the writing. It's only when you put it down and you follow God's prescription, how it's written, and you have the wherewithal, meaning you have that spiritual representation, then that action takes on another dimension of value. When you eat the matzah, it's a mundane act. You're eating flour and water, and it's unleavened. It was baked with an intent. It was baked to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah at the Seder. If you eat it and you have a mind that you want to fulfill the mitzvah, it activates certain spiritual energies which provide enrichment, which give you relevance to eternity. The words of the Torah, the words that are ordinary words. No, those words are the basis for existence. When you study it, it provides an energy that God wills existence to provide the setting that should be able to study the Torah and to actualize the mitzvos. That's what it is. Could you imagine if you have a raging fire and you have a fire extinguisher or some flame retardant to put out the fire, and you don't, and people die and the house is consumed by the flames? What is the culpability to the person who could have put out the fire and prevented all the pain and suffering and the destruction and did not? Very serious liability. Very serious. The human body itself, being a physical entity, is inclined in what direction? It's inclined to physicality, to desire, everything which represents the antithesis of spirituality. But God gave us a body to facilitate our spiritual objective, to make choices. And you have all kinds of mechanisms. You have mechanisms which could give you full control over the body, such as the study of Torah. You just have to make the right choice. Person says, I prefer not to engage. But you realize if you don't engage, automatically you go south. You go into reverse. You have a decline. So God says, I gave you an ability, and I endowed you with endowments which there's nothing compared to it. And I'm here to help you, to hold your hand, and to assist you. And you're turning your back and say, I prefer to go into the oblivion. Whether it's knowing or not knowing, person's ignorant, doesn't know. But factually, that's what's happening. He's going into the oblivion because he's not taking advantage of the endowments which God endowed him with the soul, the ability to engage in certain types of behavior patterns, which will secure his spirituality, which will advance his life and give value to his life. Person doesn't know any better, it's unfortunate. But if a person knows better, and you make a choice, I'm not interested, I don't value it. What are you saying? I prefer to allow myself to go into a decline because I believe decline is not decline. I believe decline is advancement. That's what you believe, okay? God says one thing, you say differently. The liability is tremendous liability against that person. If he knows better and he chooses not to. Person doesn't know, very small liability. Doesn't know. But the person knows better, and you could have, and you didn't. You could have put your finger in that dike to prevent the community from being inundated and destroyed. And you did not, because you didn't study Torah and didn't behave like an appropriate Jew. You could have picked up the phone and called the fire department. Or you could have prevented the burglary from taking place. And people's lives could have been saved, and you did not. It's unconscionable. If you understand what life is, how do you not pick up the phone? But people don't. I don't want to get involved. I don't want to meddle. Doesn't make a difference what you want or what you don't want. But it's incumbent upon every responsible human being to be concerned for existence and be concerned for his fellow human being. And if you could have prevented a life from being taken or people untold suffering, and you didn't, it labels you as what kind of person? Not a good person. The Ramchal writes that when we do an action, if you have, like sometimes you find in the gym, you have a rope attached to the ceiling. The ceiling can be 25 feet high, and you try to climb the rope. It's not easy to climb the rope. But the person, he wants to make sure the rope is securely attached to the ceiling. So what does he do? He gives the rope a yank to see if it's, because he's not climbing the rope, if actually his weight is going to pull it out of the ceiling. But instead of climbing it, he takes the rope and he gives it a little shake. What happens when you shake a rope? You send a tremor up the rope. It hits the ceiling. And what happens after it hits the ceiling? It comes back down. That's what happens. So Ramchal says, when we do an action on the terrestrial level, but that action has a certain energy, ability. It's a trigger. It triggers an energy. It triggers an energy from above. So when we do the action on the terrestrial level, and it triggers a reaction on the celestial, and God releases an energy to manifest itself to come back into the terrestrial. So it's like a cycle. The person acts, it activates, the energy comes. You maximize on that energy, the action now has another degree of value. It activates a great degree of energy. And it keeps building on itself. What happens? It activates an energy. Say, I've had enough. Okay, that's a whole different story. That means you have to be the receptacle to receive that energy. If you're not the receptacle, just wasted. Not only wasted, it may be a claim against the person. Here you had opportunity. How did you turn your back on the opportunity? This is within the statement. Every Jew has a share in the world to come. Every Jew has this ability to activate forces because of the nature of our soul that we have. You know, in the Olympics, they have, I don't know if they still have today, it's called the shot put. You know, you have a disc or a ball, a metal ball, and the person, he has to have great strength. That ball could weigh maybe 50 pounds. Very condensed piece of iron or lead. And he spins. And as a result of his strength, he flings the ball. And depends how far it goes. That's all based on your power, how much power you have. But the degree of power you put behind that ball, that's how far it's going to fly. You have an arrow. Now, what determines the flight path of an arrow besides the aim or the distance the arrow flies? It's the power the archer puts behind that arrow. If you have a taut bow and the archer is very strong, he's able to pull that bow back to a point which most people can't. So the energy behind that bow is unequaled by anyone else because of the strength of that archer. That arrow is going to fly a lot further. A person's a tzaddik, and he worships God with fear and love and reverence. So what does this man have that most people don't have? He has the code. What's going to launch this into another realm of existence? A person who has relevance to that realm of existence, another realm. He's a spiritualized person. But a person is a physical person. His mind is physical. His perspective is physical. His aspirations are physical. And he goes through the action, does the mitzvah. So he wants to launch something into another realm of existence, which is called spiritual. And he has to have relevance to that. If he doesn't have relevance, as much as he wants to say it should, He can't get it beyond a certain point. Very often he could do it at best at the minimal level. But you realize, but even the minimal level, over time, it grows on itself. Because the person becomes spiritualized through the action itself. So the more you engage, the more spiritualized you become, even at an ordinary level. As long as it has mitzvah value. And it does, even at the minimal level. Is a key to be affected positively after you do the action or while you're doing it, to reflect on what you're doing. What is the significance of what I'm doing? Person goes to a Seder and is invited, and they have matzah, but they go shmur matzah, the disc matzahs. And, and all that you have in mind is they taste as good as they tasted last year. And, you talk about its physical makeup, but you don't talk about its level of representation. And let's say you do talk about it. And then you reflect on the discussion. Sometimes the reflection of what was discussed has a greater impact on the person, which it usually does, than actually discussing it at the moment. Because to be able to absorb something, internalize something, you always need reflection. And that's the key. Yeah, we have this class for half an hour, 40 minutes. And we touch certain points which you enjoyed or you relate to. Now, the question is, what do you do with those points? Like there's an expression, put it in your pipe and smoke it. Remember that one? And that's not Sherlock Holmes either. Put it in your pipe and smoke it. The reflecting on certain profound concepts. And so that makes sense. I think I could go somewhere with it. And when you think about it, it gives you an understanding of other things. And those things bring you to other things. But the main concept is reflection. And reflection is only possible if there's no distraction. If there's distraction, it's very difficult to reflect. And that's what people go into meditate. They go into seclusion, not to be interrupted and disturbed, that when they focus and they reflect, they're fully engaged in whatever they're reflecting on for that reason. Very important. A person has to have a mind that's trained in a certain way. You say the Amidah, you have an audience with God, and you're having an audience with God. You believe it. But your mind is not trained to be focused. The moment you start the Amidah, although you're entering the audience, your mind is all over. You think what's going on in the office, what you can do when you get home. You think about your vacation. You think about your accountant. You think about everything. But don't you're having an audience with God, and the person doesn't deny it. The person can't help himself. His mind is all over. So it's training. It's really training of the mind. You have to reflect, what am I going to do? Who am I about to see? If you have an audience with a mortal king, it's a privilege to stand in his presence, and you were chosen to have that audience because you value to such a degree all this minutia, this other stuff, doesn't enter your mind when you have that audience. Because the degree that you value that particular moment, everything else is immediately blocked out. So reflection allows us to understand the value of what we're about to experience. And the more you reflect, the more you're able to internalize that reality, the less distraction you're going to have. But it's not easy. You say, it's incumbent upon us to praise the master of all. And we thank him that he did not make us like other nations. Our lot is not similar to theirs. And then we say, and today, this reality that God's abode is in heaven, and it's the ultimate, but we're not finished there. And it's a verse in Torah. You know, and you must take it to heart. You must internalize it. What is that? How do you internalize it? How do you take it to heart? Meaning by thinking about it, reflecting on it. It's not enough to know about it. You got to take it to heart. The other day I was giving a shiur, and I said something profound. And the person's asking me another question, not one of the Yadavon people. I said, you haven't finished swallowing yet. And you're asking the next question already. You haven't even related to the value of what you just heard, but you're on to the next question. Could this person be a beneficiary of what he heard? He's only interested in asking what he wants to ask. If he's be interested in learning, he said, I got it, the next case. But you didn't even get it. And that's the words I use. You haven't finished chewing and swallowing, and you're on to the next question already. But as a human, we're touched. If you're not touched, you don't change. You have to be touched. I always say the best way to communicate values is through a role model. You read things, it's not so easy. Intellectually, I agree, but to be touched by what you read, very rarely you're touched. But if you have a role model and you see a person being special and you're touched by him, when you're touched, then you're affected. That's the value of a role model. A person representing those values, ethics, morals, beliefs, whatever it is, and you're exposed to them and you can relate to that. And that's why we use the word you're touched. When you're touched, you touch something warm, you feel warmth. You touch something wet, you get wet. It affects you. You read something, it's abstract intellectualism. You may be touched for the moment. It's not the same. One is like what we call real time. The other is not real time. One is like seeing is believing. Reading is not seeing. That's abstract intellectualism.